Hello, friends and followers. It is Thursday afternoon, and this is the lesson for this coming Sunday, June 13th. And I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're looking forward to a good weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of you, even if all I get to do is wave this Sunday morning. It'll be nice to be back. As you know, I was out of town last week, so we didn't have a lesson sorry, something blew up in front of the camera. Didn't have a lesson for our class, but we do today, and we are in Proverbs. Well, years ago when I taught AP US History, I used to give my kids a required reading, and it was The Founding Brothers, and it was written by a historian named Joseph Ellis. And what he wanted to do was illustrate how our founding fathers had certain virtues or ideas that they thought would be necessary if we were going to have a successful democracy. And he would pick various episodes from the early life of the Republic to kind of illustrate those. Well, Ellis is not the first guy to think that having people with virtue is the best way to build a nation and the best way to build a life. And he's certainly not the first one to write a book about it. Solomon wrote a book about it 3,000 years ago, and we call it Proverbs. And what Solomon was wanting to do in this book was point out to people what it meant to live a virtuous life and what the best kind of life was. It's a very practical book. It's not so much a book of promises as it's a book of principles, of guidelines, of saying, follow this road and you end up in a different place than if you follow some other direction in life. So this summer, most of the summer, we're going to be looking at Proverbs, and we're just going to look at the very first few verses of it today. Today's going to be sort of a short lesson, and John always says there's just no such thing as a bad short sermon, and I hope you'll feel the same way about this lesson. So let's just look in chapter 1 at the first 7 verses, and we'll start with verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So David, as we all know, was the best-known king and the one through who the promise came, that it would be through him that the Messiah would come. And David, of course, you track him on back up to Abraham. Solomon was his son who became king next. And the Bible tells us that when Solomon had an opportunity to ask for something, whatever it was that God would give him, he asked for wisdom. And so when people talk about being as wise as Solomon, they're talking about being pretty wise there. And so he's writing a book to give us wisdom. And he tells us the purpose of his book, or at least one of the purposes of his book, in verse 2. And he starts by saying, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. And he ends it with the theme of the book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So Solomon is going to tell us how life is supposed to work. What is it that we need to know if we're going to live in a way that would bring honor to God and in a way that we live life from God's perspective? And he starts off by giving us 4 benefits that we'll receive if we really study and internalize this book. And the first one, he says, is that we will learn the art of skillful living. Skillful living. Now, everybody here is pretty good at something. We don't all have the same skills, but we're good at something. Judith is an excellent seamstress. She's skilled. Roger and Sue are skilled musicians. Some of you have skills that relate to your jobs. Some of you ladies are skilled when it comes to decorating your homes or to cooking. Some of you have great gardens. There are all kinds of skills that are out there. But what about the skill of living? Have we figured out what it takes to do that wisely and well? He refers to that when he uses the terms wisdom and instruction. Now, that wisdom and instruction come from two Hebrew words, and they're not words that I'd ever, seen or heard some preacher discuss before, but it's Hakma and Musar. Now, I don't speak Hebrew, so I'm not promising you that I'm pronouncing them correctly. But Hakma can be translated as wisdom. It can be translated as skill. But it's not just a head or even a heart knowledge. It's somebody who has an unusual skill in an area, like the ones we just talked about. And then you add instruction. That word musar can mean instruction. It can also mean discipline. So when you put together skill and discipline, you can usually come up with something pretty good. You think about athletes who are coachable. Their stats are going to be a whole lot better than the guy who has only talent or who is only coachable but doesn't have the raw talent. You put the two together and you get something pretty good. And so what he's telling us here is that if we will receive this instruction, if we will gain skill in living, and then we will apply it with a lot of self-discipline, we're going to see some amazing results in our lives. And that's what he's telling us here. It made me think, as I started reading this and thinking about the lesson, it made me think of, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When you've got that kind of life skill, you really can do all things because it is Christ who is strengthening you as you practice these principles that Solomon has given us here in Proverbs. It provides us with a righteousness in all areas of our life. So that's the first part of it. The second thing he tells us is that we will gain a mental alertness. That's sayings of understanding. Now, there are a lot of times that we might quote something, we might know something, we might be able to give you the right answer to something, but we don't always understand why that's the answer or how that works. We don't get into the meat of it. Like there are people who can, and I see many math students like this, who can come up with the right answer because they've memorized a formula. But why that's the formula, why that arrives at the right answer, they don't have a clue. They just know you put a squared plus b squared and you keep on going. But they don't know why that works. What he's saying is to be able to work through something, to understand exactly what's really being said, to read between the lines, that sort of thing. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the world today that has stuff in between the lines, and that's not new, but it's certainly true for our generation. You see that in many ways, but one of the areas that you see it a lot in is music. If you listen to, say, rap music, you're going to hear a real worldview there that may or may not reflect God's view of the world. It depends on who the rapper is. But you don't have to listen to rap music to come up with that. John Lennon, a whole lot of you would be familiar with the Beatles or with the musical careers of the members of the Beatles afterwards. And those of you who even aren't would probably recognize the name John Lennon. And I bet everybody in here would recognize his most popular solo single, which was Imagine. And I'm not fixing to quote all of it to you, but I want you to listen to at least part of it, where he says, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. In another verse, it's, imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. And he keeps on going. Okay, well, there's a worldview in that song. And it's not a worldview that honors the Lord. It's a complete worldview of atheism and forget all of this. And he goes on to talk about no possessions, no greed, no anything. So it's very different than the worldview that most of us have. And yet, we know that song. We've probably hummed along with it before. But if we stop to think about what it is that it means, sometimes you're watching a TV show and out of the blue, something comes out of it that you go, wow, what did I just say? And it's not that they use some vulgar language or something that caught our attention. It's a meaning behind what it is that they're saying. And you're going, I'm not so sure about that. That's what Solomon's talking about here, having discernment, the ability to read between the lines and recognize what people are saying here and not just get sucked into whatever is being sold to you. The third thing he tells us is that it will give us moral insight. And that's what he's talking about in verse 3. We can accept principles of right behavior. And one of the words that can be used in there, if you go on into verse 4, is prudence. Now, you just have to be a little older than a few of the people in our class and not as old as most of the people in our class to remember President George Bush. Not George II, not George Walker Bush, but Daddy Bush. And he was very well known for saying things, wouldn't be prudent. And what he's saying was that wouldn't be a wise choice. That wouldn't come out with a good outcome for the person or for the nation. We could do this, but it wouldn't be prudent. Stop and think is what he's saying. And all of us know people who are book smart, but they can't find their way out of a paper bag. They don't have any street smarts at all. And what Solomon is saying is you need to have some street smarts here. You need to understand prudence, what works and what doesn't. Now, you may have street smarts on some streets, but there are other neighborhoods that you don't have a clue how you're supposed to act or what you're supposed to do. Solomon's Proverbs are designed to help us walk all the different streets that we may go down in life and have some street smarts about how to handle it. Have some prudence. That's what he's talking about. What's coming your way? Can you deal with it however it shows up? And then fourth, it's to help us grow up. He says to the youth, knowledge and discretion. And he talks about the naive in verse 4 and the wise man in verse 5. So he's got a broad audience here. He's talking about, first of all, the gullible people, the ones who just soak in whatever saying, yeah, okay. And they get taken in by the world. Jesus talked about that when he was talking about the seed and people who got sucked up by the world. We need to be careful about that. Solomon told us that. And then they're the young, those that are just starting out. They just don't have much life experience yet. And they may want to make the right choice, but they just don't know what direction to go. He's saying this is the direction. This is it. This is the way to go. And then to the wise, the old. Well, everybody in here, let's just put it this way. Some of us are old, but not all of us are wise. We'll just go with that. And most of us are not as wise as we think we are. We continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. Now, maybe we're wise in some areas, but we just can't learn when we need to shut our mouth in a situation. We can't learn when we don't need to pop off. We can't learn when we need to walk away. We can't learn some things. We just seem to keep on doing it, keep on doing it. What he's saying is a wise man can get wiser. You can teach an old dog new tricks. It's better for his life if he learns them when he's young. But if you're still living, then God's saying there's still time for you to learn something else. So that's what he's going to teach us here in Proverbs. And in verse 7, when he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline, he's summing up the whole book in that one phrase. And let's look at the second half of it, and then we'll back up to the first half, and then we'll be done. When he talks about fools, the Bible has a lot of different words for fools. Sometimes it talks about an angry fool. Sometimes it talks about a gullible fool. Sometimes it talks about someone who's drunken and foolish. But the kind of fool that he's talking about here is the highest level of a fool. It's a person who is arrogant and stubborn and refuses to admit that there's anything they don't know and anybody that could give them any advice. It's the person who will not listen. That kind of fool despises wisdom and knowledge, because after all, they know it all. And what Solomon is saying is, don't be that kind of fool. Don't be that person. All of us know people who are wise in some areas. But all of us know that we're not wise in everything. And we need to be careful that we are willing to look for help when we need it. If I'm faced with this ticking time bomb, it's not the time for me to say, oh, I know what I'm doing here, just fake it on out. We don't need to call a bomb expert. I'm sure what we need to do is just clip this little red wire right here. I mean, after all, what could go wrong? How stupid. How stupid. Don't be a fool, because that time bomb can go off. Okay, and then go back to the first part of the verse where he says the fear of the Lord. He's not talking about terror. He's not talking about being scared to death of God. No, what he's talking about is recognizing that God is God and we're not. That God created the universe, that he knows how it works, that he has the answers, and that we go to him in search of that. The road to wisdom does not lead to a